When you think Australian beer, what's the first thing that comes to mind? If you said this, then shame on you.
Australia has a rich beer culture, and in recent years has really boomed, and its craft beer industry has rose to rival many US breweries in quality, consistency, and experimentation. Part of that is thanks to the great hops growing in Australia, favorites like Galaxy and Topaz. Australia alone grew 3.75 million pounds of hops in 2021. But it's also in part due to homebrewing being quite popular. In fact, did you know that brew in a bag was invented by an Aussie? So as a beer lover myself, I decided to take a trip down under to see this with my own eyes, specifically to Sydney. After a grueling 15-hour flight, with a bit of jet lag and a thirst for beer, I headed out in search of the best beer that Sydney had to offer. First stop, the aptly named Sydney Brewery. They have a couple locations, and this is the smaller of the two, located in the Surrey Hills neighborhood. And it definitely has a bit of that neighborhood vibe. They have a few core beers that they brew at their other location, but the bartender said that here they tend to brew more experimental stuff. I started with the Quake IPA because you don't often see breweries outright labeling their beers with the yeast. It was not too bitter, juicy fruit flavors, and pretty decent if you're into hazies. My wife got the Pilsner, and it was extremely refreshing, especially after such a long trip. And then we decided to stick around and try out some more unique stuff, like their spiced ale, agave ginger cider, and lumberjack rye, which were each standouts, especially that agave ginger cider, which I love seeing some cider options at our brewery. Overall, a really solid brewery not too far from downtown. If you come, definitely go for the inventive stuff. And if I had to give it an award, I say that Sydney Brewery gets the Best Experimental Brewery Award. Okay kids, now's a good time to talk about some new vocabulary and slang that you might hear at an Australian brewery. The first one came at me right on my first pint, and it's schooner. Schooner is probably the most common beer glass you'll see. Here's the one from Sydney Brewery. British pint glasses are usually around 570 milliliters, and US pints are about 473, but a schooner is more like 425 milliliters, which to me is like a really great size. Enough to get a good taste, but not so much that it warms your beer up if you're a slow drinker. But this is just really true of this area of Australia. Apparently a schooner is different in South Australia, but now you know. Next we head towards Sydney Harbour, and right across from the famous Opera House is a brewery with some of the best views in the world. Squires Landing, by Malt Shovel Brewery. The Squire in the name refers to the beer line that Malt Shovel makes, called James Squire. Squire is considered to be the man that first cultivated hops in Australia, and actually has a pretty interesting life story worth reading on their website. And while this isn't their main brewery, they have like 8 brewhouses across Australia. This is their flagship brewhouse. And boy, does it have great scenery. You can sit right outside, and to your right is the Opera House, and to the left, the Harbour Bridge. You can definitely tell this place has a bit more budget with their decor. These tap lines look really cool, with a sample of the beer in the side glass right above the tap. And they even have this little brewery that sits on a glass box, floating from the second floor. I can't even imagine brewing in that. The sights are great, but it looks tiny. I started with a schooner of their Australian Pale, because when in Sydney, right? It was crisp, malty, and extremely sparkling. In fact, for the most part, all of the beers seemed to be a bit more carbonated than I'm used to, but I actually quite enjoyed that. I followed the Australian Pale up with a flight, or a paddle as they call it here. And at least at this spot, their tasters were a bit bigger, 210 milliliters, basically a half pint. I tried the Hazy, West Coast IPA, and a few of their other regular beers. All were decent, no real complaints, but not blowing me out of the water either. And for that, I give Squires Landing the brewery with the best views award. Just up the road from the harbour sits our next destination. Located in the Rocks area of Sydney is a quaint hotel with a historic brewery on the ground level. This is Lord Nelson Brewery Hotel, Australia's oldest pub brewery. And as it suggests, it has a place to stay the night and a pub to drink in. Honestly, you might miss this spot if you weren't looking for it, but once you step inside, you're instantly transported to a classic English pub. And this place doesn't mess around with the beer. They only make ales using 100% natural ingredients and have staples like English bitter and porter, which they brew in a tiny room tucked away in the back. This place very much feels like a local favorite. It was quite full inside, even on a weekday. We grabbed a spot outside and enjoyed the bitter and the summer ale. Both were on the high end for carbonation, for what you might expect an English beer to be, but other than that, they were really solid beer flavored beers. So if you're not into experimental stuff, then this is probably your spot. Lord Nelson Brewery gets the Best Old-Timey Brewery Award. Another fun vocab word, or at least a slang that I picked up at the spots, was too easy, as in, no worries. Basically at every spot, when I ordered my beer, too easy. Too easy. Too easy, mate. Sorry about that. But definitely will be bringing that one home with me. from a no-frills brewery to something a bit more strange and modern. Just south of Darling Harbor is a spot that's half Japanese gyoza restaurant and half brewery taproom. This is Yoyogi Brewery at Harajuku Gyoza. This area seems to be a bit of a business district, but if you find yourself here, you're in for a treat. Not only is the food phenomenal, but the beer is some of the most eclectic and interesting flavors I've ever had. The owners brought their love of Japanese food, beer, and culture and planted themselves right in Sydney to share their passion. I had to get a flight so I could try a good variety. Their dry rice lager was very dry and crisp, one of the better ones I've had recently. But they also had a black rice lager, which was even more complex while still holding on to that dry finish. The other ones were more unique. A passion fruit kolsch, which man, that just screamed summer in a glass. And of course I had to try the chocolate pretzel porter. It was everything you'd expect, chocolatey with a touch of that pretzel bread flavor on the finish, but not overly thick or sweet. It was an easy one to finish for sure. They also had some yuzu beers that sounded great. Actually, after leaving Australia, I had a ton of yuzu and passion fruit foods and drinks. Two ingredients I don't use often, but would love to incorporate into some upcoming brews. Overall, very surprised by this little place. Definitely worth checking out for an awesome lunch break. So I'll give Yoyogi Brewery the Most Unique Brewery Award. Before we head over to my last and favorite brewery of the trip, I wanted to take a moment to point out some other great breweries that some of you recommended that I check out. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to them all, but I found a lot of their beers at grocery stores or bottle shops. Young Henry's. These guys were sold everywhere, but their brewery is over in Newtown. I tried the Australian Pale Ale, of course, and it was quite pleasant. Little Creatures is technically out of Western Australia, but they were recommended to me, so I picked up their XPA. XPA, or Extra Pale Ale, is an interesting style that I don't often see in the States, but quite a few places here have their own version. Not my favorite beer, but maybe some of their other ones are better. The Grifter Brewing Co. and Merrickville came highly recommended, and their space looks awesome. I snagged a watermelon pilsner, and it was delicious. Light and fruity, but it didn't taste like artificial watermelon. You could tell they were using the real thing. Next is One Drop Brewing Co. in Botany, right by the airport. They make this blueberry raspberry sour that blew me away. One of the best sours I've ever had. And just looking at their Instagram, they have a ton of mouth-watering beers. And lastly, Mountain Culture Brew Co. This was probably the most recommended brewery to me, but they're also like an hour and a half west of the city. So I wasn't able to make it, but I did try this NE IPA, but this stands up there with some of the better ones I've ever had. Overall, very happy with the beer selection in Australia. But as mentioned, I saved the best for last. Ah yes, Bondi Beach. Surf, sun, and lots of great art. But we're here for the beer. And a block off the beach is a little brewery called Curly Lewis. This place was like I stepped into a portal back home to San Diego. Chill vibes, surf and skate culture, and man, do they make phenomenal brews. We snagged a spot in the back, right next to these small tanks, and enjoyed another paddle. Clean cut lager, yuzu lager, Bondi Haze Ale, and ending with the Berry Bomb, a fruited sour with raspberries. Each one of these beers was fantastic. Some of the best I had on the entire trip collectively. My favorite being the lager, probably the best straightforward lager I've had on this trip. The yuzu made another appearance here, and it was real refreshing. And the raspberry sour was like a tart raspberry sorbet, creamy and just delightful. Good music, great beer, and we ended up hanging here for a bit because it was just the right kind of vibe. And for that reason, I give Curly Lewis the tastiest beer and a bonus Best Vibes award. Absolutely worth checking this place out. And with that, the trip had just about come to an end. And while it was filled with other great adventures, the beer is what really stood out to me in Sydney. I'm definitely bringing back some inspiration for some new beers.
So cheers to you, Australia. You truly have some world-class beer. Now, I'm off to pound this Foster's and eat some Outback Steakhouse.